a deeper dive into all things evaluation. In a few minutes, I'm going to add some links to the chat. So the first will be to join our Eval Cafe mailing list. You can stay in the loop of any of our upcoming presentations. We have one more presentation left in our fall series, and then we have a pretty great spring lineup that will be launching soon. The second will be the schedule for the rest of this semester's presentation, and you can register there. You can also view recordings from past presentations. Before we begin, we do like to take a moment to acknowledge the history of the land that we're located on. Western Michigan University is on the ancestral lands of the Three Fires Confederacy, which was historically occupied by the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations, and we honor their stewardship and connection to the land. Today, we're excited to be joined by Andrea Allen, Principal Consultant at AC Insights, and Kenlana Ferguson, Executive Director of Michigan Transformation Collective. If you have any questions during the presentation, you'll see a Q&A box on your little bar at the bottom there. You can also enter questions into the chat, thoughts at any time, and you can use the reaction button to raise your hand. So we have plenty of ways for you to interact. We're happy we're here. And with that, I will go ahead and hand it over to our presenters.
Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and pull up my screen here. Andrea, you can take us away. Andrea.
The basics. You would think I would get this by now. Okay. Hi, everyone. Kenlana and I have been looking forward to today's conversation. And you'll note that each of us approaches the topic of evaluation in a trust-based philanthropy context from a very different direction. In my case, I'm a cultural anthropologist who has practiced evaluation in both international development and academic contexts, primarily in Latin America, Africa, and the US, with an emphasis on participatory methods and social inclusion, focused on gender, ethnicity, and socioeconomic status. Learning about evaluation in a trust-based context came about as I made a recent career transition from an international focus to very locally based work, immersing myself in the literature and talking to local, which is Southwest Michigan-based funders and nonprofit practitioners who have firsthand experience. Kenlana will now share her own very different background and experience before we go on with the slides.
Sure. Thank you, Andrea. My name is Kenlana Ferguson, and as mentioned, I'm the Executive Director at Michigan Transformation Collective. Prior to coming to MTC, I worked for about almost 2 years at Kalamazoo Community Foundation, where my role was Director of Equity, Learning, and Culture, which is very relevant to the conversation today, and you'll learn a little bit more about that. By training, I'm a psychologist, and I have a long history and career in the mental health field, in particular working with Black and Brown people with a specific focus on race and racial trauma.
Okay, so next slide, please.
My click is not, oh, there we go. Sorry. There we go.
Okay, so in my efforts to explore how the smaller, low-resource nonprofits hereabouts view evaluation, I was told by one experienced colleague they mostly hate evaluation. And so far too often, evaluation activities can be viewed as a superficial information gathering and writing task that takes too much time away from the staff doing their real work, which is program implementation. Meanwhile, the inherent power imbalances among nonprofit, funder, and evaluator had remained unquestioned. The information generally flows in one direction only, from grantee to funder, with a focus on compliance, monitoring, and proving-based reporting, while distrust seems to flow on a two-way street. According to Brenda Solorzano, CEO of the Headwater Foundation, and I quote, "Organizations share what they believe funders will want to hear, and staff then pass along the information they think the boards will want to hear. It's a game that many know is being played, but that our sector refuses to call out. Many funders, my former self included, according to Brenda, ask grantees for reports and data that they never or rarely read. Before we get too far into this topic, how many of you are already familiar with this concept of trust-based philanthropy? Could you raise your virtual or real hands in the process? Just trying to scroll through here and get a read of the room. Oh, got a few thumbs up there. Okay. We got some, this will be a great conversation in that respect then.
I'm especially drawn to whoever shared all of those claps.
Oh, I know, they were enthusiastic. So to put us on the same page in terms of what what the literature says on trust-based philanthropy, and I'm sure you can chime in later or in the chat to, put in your 2 cents or $1. First, we're going to be exploring why we as evaluators benefit from exploring the ongoing trust-based movement among US-based funders. Second, what a trust-based philanthropy looks like in general, and what the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project refers to as grounding on this topic. Third, the key takeaways from the literature on learning and evaluation offered on the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project's websites and several recent publications. And I'll say that initially that was my only knowledge of this approach in philanthropy. So hence, I thought it really important for this presentation to bring in Kenlana, who can do a deep dive into both of our conversations with funders and her own experience, including some befuddling tensions in addressing learning and evaluation in the actual work. And afterwards, we hope to leave some time for discussion. So why should we even care about trust-based philanthropy to begin with? In my case, and Kenlana will soon share a different story, I had just recently retired from Michigan State University, launched my work as an independent consultant, and was conducting an informal landscape analysis of those Kalamazoo-based funders and nonprofits working on equity issues. In the process, I discovered that one very large local funder explicitly mentioned trust-based philanthropy on their website. And I then found another local funder presenting on trust-based philanthropy at a national meeting. I soon began to dig deeper into the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project website, which has a host of information, by the way, including its efforts to track associated change among 20 or so funders and philanthropy serving organizations with whom they've connected, and as represented on this map from the project website. I would add that my own discoveries of the trust-based work here in Southwest Michigan are not yet represented on this map, or not were at the time that I took this off, which was 2023. For example, a few summers back, while carrying out a small gig for the United Way of Southeast Michigan and looking around for guidance from their national office, I discovered that the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project, together with the United Way of South Central Michigan, facilitated an in-person session on a trust-based approach at a United Way national meeting over that summer. And I eventually learned that the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project was scheduled to hold a breakout session at the Conference of Michigan Foundations, their 51st annual conference held in Detroit that same year. But the real clincher for me was in learning about the values-based approach embraced in the practice of the trust-based philanthropy, including a set of values that I am prioritizing in my own work, including systemic equity, that is an equitable distribution of power, a relationship-centered approach, servant leadership, transparency and accountability, all with strong attention to learning. So moving on to examine what the term trust-based philanthropy actually means. The trust-based project, philanthropy project, describes those aforementioned values as positioned at the very center of this approach, requiring attention to equity and power issues within the organization's culture, structure, leadership, and practice. Our time today doesn't allow for a thorough consideration, of each of these dimensions. So I've zeroed in on a dimension of practice with clear ties to the practice of evaluation. The 6 practices here are those commonly cited as core to the implementation of a trust-based funding approach. And these include, first, multi-year unrestricted funding, the expectation that foundation staff will do the ongoing homework necessary to learn about the organization and its activities, reduction of paperwork requirements for grantees, being transparent and responsive in its activities, eliciting and responding to feedback from grantees, and offering substantive support beyond a simple check-in or check-up on grantees. Now focusing on one aspect of trust-based philanthropy project, that of program evaluation. The shift from doing business as usual to a trust-based approach to evaluation can be described in a nutshell as a transition from compliance, monitoring, and proving-based reporting to collaborative learning, carried out jointly by grantees and the funder. Whether or not an evaluator is included in this process will be up to the foundation or the grantees involved. So why this shift? It's accomplished not only to reduce the grantee burden, but also to demonstrate trust and humility on the part of the funder through repositioning grantee and funder on horizontal levels, with both invested in a mutually beneficial relationship as they seek to better understand their communities, the issues at hand, and how best to support grantee impact goals. So how exactly is this shift to be accomplished? Essentially, the funder staff appears to be taking on a different set of tasks that, if done well, are likely to be more time intensive than the traditional top-down edicts for data extraction. Reduction in narrative requirements sync well with our increased awareness of white dominant cultural elevation of the written word, together with recognition of other valid forms of information sharing, potentially more amenable to learning all around. And as a quick aside, I must admit that the possibility of taking the written word out of learning and evaluation initially sent a shot of cortisol through my own system, because I've always viewed writing as my thing. At the same time, we must consider the sorts of structural shifts and other specific adaptations the funder will need to make to accommodate this new way of doing business. The next 3 slides capture at least some of how the trust-based philanthropy project's panelists in their webinar on learning and evaluation have set out on this journey. So I do a quick vignette of the 3 foundations that were featured. Here I have tried to capture these learnings that resonated most for me. The first example comes from the Headwaters Foundation. And while I think it's my representation is very simplified, it provides the gist of the dynamics, including quarterly conversations between foundation staff and grantees, which allow regular check-ins on how well the process of collaboration is going. Then on a yearly basis, a rich set of grantee-defined outcomes supporting the collaborative learning conversations focused on better conversation of not only their initiative, but the overall dynamics of the early childhood ecosystem, in this case, and delivery of healthcare services to various marginalized communities in the foundation's program area. So the foundation is bringing in the grantees to actively look at and critique their larger portfolio within which that grant sits. And finally, only after about 5 or 10 years do the funder and grantees consider long-term impacts by taking a look at fundamental changes in policies, practices, and systems that have occurred in their domain of concern. And I suggest Googling Headwaters Foundation Learning Book, Headwaters Foundation Learning Book, to learn more about how these levels are defined and implemented in practice, because the practical dimensions of this are something to think about, and something that the higher leadership of that, we'll say horizontal leadership, the leadership of the funder really needs to get on board with. In the case of the Satterberg Foundation, Their executive director, Sarah Walziak, describes what sounds like their initial actions to adopt a trust-based approach in their organization. They've eliminated written reports in favor of yearly check-ins, slowed the pace of workflow in favor of reflection and learning conversations, and in the process, they've realized that additional changes are needed in their foundation infrastructure, including what I interpreted as a need to staff up to create more time for funder program staff to dedicate to each grantee. Another structural shift on which the Satterberg Foundation has embarked, according to that foundation's website, involves strengthening their efforts to provide general operating support to the organizations that serve and partner with communities most impacted by historical and systemic racism. As such, they have most recently shifted from grant making to grantee retention. As they put it, I quote, instead of taking new applications, we're focusing on the 300 plus nonprofits with whom we are in deep relationships. And finally, among the case studies that I'm going to feature, we have the American Jewish World Service, and it looks like the foundation's evolution towards a trust-based approach happens in pieces. As Sherry Turitz, the vice president for programs in this foundation, put it, like the first two examples, this funder has simplified data gathering and shifted all or part of the burden to the funder's staff. Within that funding organization, a newer evaluation unit has formed deeper ties with their program staff. And finally, decision-making on awards, along with the leadership for learning, has shifted to their local staff in multiple offices across Africa, Latin America, and the US. So one key area I'd like to know more about involves Sherry Turitz's brief note on grantee capacity building or accompaniment and program evaluation. She said there's more there needing attention than the foundation could do alone. So how do they address this issue? I left this landscape study of my own with many questions, as I'm sure will occur to you, and we can hopefully have a bit of time to address these in more detail at the end. But first, let's hear from Kenlana on local funder experience with evaluation in trust-based context.
Thank you, Andrea. My position in this space is as one who worked in a local community foundation and brought into this particular foundation along the way as they were implementing the trust-based philanthropy framework or model. And I just say implementing the model because I don't know that it was explicit or identified that this is what they were doing. They were undergoing pretty much a transformation within the foundation where they adopted new core values, and they were looking at how to operationalize core values around anti-racism, learning, joy, and love, all moving in a direction towards being anti-oppressive. And so my role actually was a result of that journey. And I say this because one of the things that we will hear as we talk about my experience and those of my colleagues in the community is that absent of really the shifts within the organization, you're just taking on principles and practices with really no heart for what it really means to be trust-based in our work in philanthropy. So as you can see on the screen, the entire model for my role as Director of Equity, Learning, and Culture was taken from the trust-based approach. So I was responsible for culture work, which was really thinking about and strengthening internal trust and learning within the organization. My role was an enterprise role, and it was not identified as a DEI role. So it was really to help implement core values and operationalize the anti-racist values that had been shifted within the organization. I also was responsible for looking at some of the structures and thinking about how we redesign evaluation towards equity and learning. Evaluation is a scary word, and in that context of that foundation, it was a word that had a lot of I would say a lot of perspectives attached to it. So the documentation and the rhythm of learning and reflection was something that the organization was pretty much looking to get in the rhythm of doing those things from the trust-based philanthropy approach. And then leadership. So when you work in a foundation and you have all of these teams, the foundation was pretty siloed. And so part of the role that I had was to really engage what Andrea said, that collaborative learning, yes, with grantees, but also within the organization. So to really kind of support the entire organization in adopting a learning culture. And then we were in leadership transition, and we all know that when leadership changes and transition is happening, we lose a lot of institutional knowledge. We lose some of our champions for the work. And so my role was to help along the way as well. And then, of course, the practices related to trust-based philanthropy. So as I entered into the organization, I did not have a background in philanthropy, and it was a beautiful experience to have space to really come to learn about philanthropy. And the first book that I read was Decolonizing Wealth. And I think that spoke a lot to me as a person who is, as a person committed to anti-racism. But what it said to me was that I was in the right place and in the right space with a foundation that was not perfect, but moving towards really decolonizing wealth. So that was everything that we were doing was not just to better our organization or the foundation, but it was to better our community, but it also is addressing systemic racism. So it was a beautiful opportunity to learn about philanthropy through that lens. And I say that because I didn't come with all of the old frame of philanthropy. So I got a lot of permissions in this role to really learn about trust-based philanthropy and try to do it without having a counter frame for what philanthropy was supposed to be like. So what I understood from where I was coming into the organization and what I was tasked with was that the foundation really lacked this evaluation backbone that is needed to really support trust and learning using the trust-based philanthropy framework. So there had been no intentional learning cadence. I think people were learning, of course, but definitely more skill-based learning. And then no consistent documentation practices in alignment with the trust-based philanthropy framework. So, of course, there's documentation. Folks were doing their job, but with the framework's implementation, those practices had not yet been institutionalized across the organization, and meaning making. So there was no infrastructure or learning that was established that unified the way meaning was being made together across the organization and across the grantee partners. So the gap wasn't commitment, as you've heard. These were the right values, the right permissions, the right framework, but the infrastructure wasn't there. So what we tried to build as a department, so it was a department, equity, learning, and culture, again, building that learning culture. So the reflective learning spaces were a priority, so those were implemented. Definitely experimenting with different ways to document in real time and to capture field notes along the way. Thinking about values-based measurement, evaluation, and learning. I will say that when I came into the foundation, we were focused on measurement and evaluation, of course, across our grant partners, but didn't have any way to measure changes and transitions that were happening within people and within the internal organization. And that's really important for the trust-based philanthropy framework. And so transparent conversations are also a part of this. You can't do a lot of meaning making together if you're not engaging with one another and being open in our conversations. The reduced reporting burden, that was a priority for like our community impact team. And so they were doing a really good job. And so we were kind of looking and working together to identify how to do that using an equity lens, and how to balance out what they needed to know and understand, and how to collect that data. And then how to integrate and embed racial healing and community care in the learning that we were doing in the work. So some challenges, of course, there are challenges, and some of you who raised your hand said you know about it. I'm assuming there are a couple of people who have probably worked with the trust-based philanthropy framework as well, and or the approach as well. And so some of these may be familiar. Culture change and shifting culture is slow. No matter how committed you are to the work, that's a long-term process. And so whenever you're implementing a new approach or new frameworks, many of us want to see quick wins and or to understand or know that what we're doing is working, and that's not what we had. So setting the appropriate expectations for the changes that we needed to make over time to really call ourselves trust-based. And you will see how that got really interesting for one of our partners in community. Staff turnover, of course. There was history that needed to be understood, and there was some learning lost also because many of the people who champion really moving towards anti-racism within the foundation, some of those people were no longer there. And again, that leadership change and that inconsistency was also a challenge. And then also, I mentioned before, silo teams. So there was really no shared learning happening across the different groups. Some of our teams had their heads down and didn't see how this was a part of their responsibility also. And then again, evaluation was not necessarily prioritized across the institution outside of the community engagement team. And then one of the biggest challenges for me was anytime we tried to add structure to our trust-based approach, um, white dominant culture was named. So Andrea mentioned earlier, like, you know, the written word and some of those things. So we had to do a lot of explaining around what we meant by structure. So some of the lessons that I learned is that trust requires structure. And in particular, the structure of learning and putting in evaluation systems so that expectations are there and that the learning is not ambiguous. And so I often talked with my colleagues about like things being loose. We would have beautiful conversations, but there was no way for us to really capture that as part of what we were learning and how we were growing. Values do not operationalize themselves, so an anti-racist commitment must be matched with the infrastructure needed to be on a journey and to really be able to assess how we're doing. Culture change needs consistency and capacity, and the trust-based approach absolutely needs capacity. And then clarity is care. We always say clear is kind. And so roles, expectation, and learning must be explicit. For me, that was really important because trust-based approach requires everyone in all parts of the organizations to be engaged in the implementation. So that's not just in this situation, that was not just my role in my department, it required everybody. And documentation matters. So I'll stop here for a moment just to see if anyone has any questions before I jump into a few more stories from folks that we talk with in the field.
And just a reminder, you can put questions in the chat. You can use the reaction button to raise your hand, or you can go ahead and put them in the Q&A and we'll keep an eye on it.
Okay, so I will continue. So Andrea and I, you don't just take one person's experience and leave it there. Also, Andrea got really curious also as I shared my experience with her, and she often said, like, who else can we talk to? And I'm like, sure, there are other people in our community that we can talk to. So we did just that in trying to kind of really understand what the trust-based implementation of the trust-based approach was like for folks from on the inside, and in particular, their understanding of evaluation connected to the trust-based approach. So as we talk about this, or what came out for us were tensions, right? Most people, just like myself, understood the journey that we were on as a really beautiful journey. And along the way, things were hard. And so they also identified some very unique challenges and tensions, and I will share those with you now. So the first thing that arose from our conversation was similar to mine, trust without structure. So some of the words and themes that came out of these conversations was around funders adopting the ethos of trust-based philanthropy, meaning they talked a lot about the relationship, trust, and flexibility, but did not take on the harder work of creating the infrastructure needed to support the learning. So in particular, there was an absence of structured check-ins for some, no internal field notes, no shared learning questions, and the documentation of what was working and was not a part of the process for some of them. And so around this tension, they talked about having no ability to tell the story, the journey towards becoming trust-based, or to understand the impact that becoming trust-based or being trust-based was having in community. The second tension that they shared was around the burden being shifted to staff. So the approach does put the onus a little bit more on the foundation. And what came up in our conversation was that they believed, even for themselves, that, adopting a trust-based approach would take away some of those problematic structures that required overworking, or in some ways, how they felt like exploited in some capacities. So there was a myth that trust-based would be an easier approach to doing the work, but in reality, it became a lot more demanding, both relationally and structurally. And then one person shared that they were too far in and didn't realize how much staff time was going to be needed for the trust-based approach. Again, this approach requires that everyone all across the organization join in and take on the principles and the practices and the values. So for many people like myself, it was tasked to a role, but then the implementation has to involve everyone from the organization. And for some folks, that was burdensome. One person shared that even during the time that they were implementing the approach, they lost staff and they couldn't sustain the relationships that they started building because the engagement and what that looked like changed. And they started to do those things, but without adequate staffing, they weren't able to maintain it. And this goes back to the myth that one shared. So funders have to hold more of the evaluation work and not less. So ultimately, from what we heard in the field, it requires more capacity to take on a trust-based approach, not less. The third tension that we heard was power still shows up. I really appreciated conversations around this. So I'm going to put several of these up. So it was shared with us that funders in their survey that they did believe that relationships were stronger, while grantees really many grantees reported fear, hesitancy, and confusion. around even the shift in how they were engaging with the grantees and the grantee partners. It was really confusing. So this is how we used to engage. Maybe it was a submit a report. And then all of a sudden, you want to meet, you want to talk, you want to come to our facility. And really, there was some distrust in that. But they would also report feeling that like some fear around that, or not really being sure what that was about. But the funders, because they were engaging with grantees and talking with them, they started to believe that the relationships were strong. So it was shared with us that many of the funders would say that trust was being built while grantees still felt unsafe. So overall, from this part of the conversation and the things that came up, just the understanding that trust-based doesn't erase power, it reveals it. And so power has to be something that is a part of the conversation and discussed openly, but then also has to be a part of what we're learning is how power is being shifted within the approach. And then the fourth tension was around risk without reflection. So some folks shared that funders took risks using this approach with new partners, and some of those grants didn't go well. And the reflection around what was working, what didn't work was very minimal. And so one of the people we talked with said we didn't stay in the learning. So they were taking on some of these approaches or different ways of doing things or practices, but not engaging in the learning that was necessary to really understand how this was impacting the grantee partners, also the impact that this was having on their relationships, but also in the work that both partners were trying to move in community. So the absence of learning systems resulted in a loss of insight, ability to adapt along the way, and then some missed opportunities for growth. And then the last tension was around the trend of trust-based philanthropy. So we heard this from folks. Everybody talked about funders adopting language without the deeper systems change that's needed to really take this on. I do feel that where I was working, because they were already doing some of that culture change, that deeper change within their organization, but also had their eyes on like, how do we transform philanthropy? That we were in a systems change process. And I know that that is still hard. And sometimes that's bigger work than, anyone ever truly understands until they take it on. But some of our folks in the field said that some funders took on the language because it was cute and sexy, but really didn't understand how challenging it was going to be or how deep they needed to go. Especially when some of the learning that needed to occur and unearthing that power meant that, people had to go within themselves and really truly understand their oppressive practices and their mindsets in a lot of the learning that needed to occur. Many people weren't up for that task. Leadership transitions also came up because many of the folks in the field had leadership really championing the efforts. And then when those folks left, then it was the folks who didn't have the same level of power still trying to move the work. So it felt pretty trending and was never institutionalized or became the discipline practice within the organization. And one person shared with us that now they're seeing foundations kind of revert or move away from just being so explicit about being trust-based, but wanting to keep the structure or the model of relationship centeredness. And so, some people may say that that's about trying to find balance. Or it can be argued that really implementing and being true to trust-based philanthropy is just too heavy of a lift for some organizations. So, as I conclude, I just kind of want to say, if we take my experience and the experiences of other folks who have worked in philanthropy in Kalamazoo, I will say that we've seen some moments where, you know, some of the learning and evaluation and using the trust-based approach has been really towards being more reflective and being more relational and learning about liberatory evaluation and data practices. And that has happened. So increased knowledge and awareness of it. But some of the absence of truly building out the infrastructure and the capacity for it, and the practices of truly being a part of a learning culture has caused harm. So we see patterns when trust is paired with evaluation, it can really benefit community and deepening relationships and the foundations in deepening relationships. But when it's ambiguous still, when power is still at play without evaluating or learning about how that's being used and shifted, it just creates more challenges. So that's what we heard from the folks in the field, and that's my experience. And so I can take some questions and then we'll turn it back over to you, Andrea.
Okay, and I do have a couple of questions from the chat if you want me to go ahead and read them to you, and
Sure.
we can go from there.
Okay.
Okay, so first is, what does the learning really look like in concrete terms? What happens? How is it captured? How are the lessons learned, shared, or sustained?
I can talk about my experience. So, this was some of my favorite work to do. And so, the learning model that we use started with the individual. So it was what does an individual need to truly know, learn, understand, um, to sharpen their lens to get them prepared for the actions or the activities of being trust-based. You know, so when you think about systems change in that inverted like triangle, we talked a lot about like policies and practices, and then we also talked about relationships, but you know, mindsets and ideologies and understandings that you needed to first take on before just kind of engaging in practices is actually where we started. So we implemented an org-wide pretty much learning process or system that was tied to, you know, professional development plans and really resourcing those, and then engaging in spaces of learning, like I mentioned about that. So one of the things that we did along the way was to really unpack the trust-based approach, and really dig in and have conversations within the organizations and talking across team around what responsibilities they believed they had, from their respective seats in the organization to implement the trust-based approach. And so really engage spaces where there's a lot of conversation, where there's a lot of reflection, and then moving towards how do we then take what we learn, capture what we learn, and now start talking about how we take that outside in the community. There were a lot of conversations around like how we were hyper focused on the engagement and the relationship building outside, but like how do we bring that in? We had also like racial healing circles where we were really trying to engage around our shared humanity. So we dove in from the inside and then kind of coming out. And so the documentation around what we were learning from our conversations with community partners looked like a lot of revisions of forms and documents, and like sharing with our grantee partners, like, okay, we're experimenting with a new way of capturing learning and engaging with you to learn about the work that you're doing in your organization, not necessarily in numbers, but maybe in storytelling. So there were a few models along the way that were tried out, and they landed on an approach that that they felt really comfortable with in engaging with grantee partners around like data collection, learning about the different organizations. I will say some of the learning was about going to programs and projects that were hosted by that organization and taking field notes. So those are just a few examples, and there is a long list of other things that happened along the way. So I will say that many of the teams who were really invested in really doing this work were open to experimentation and then giving it some time to really try out some practices or new ways of documenting or data collection to see how the effectiveness of that, and then getting feedback from the partners.
Great, thank you. And for the next one, I do think you've touched on it and it kind of feeds really well into it, but it's a great question. So I just want to make sure if there's anything else you wanted to add. So you've named the importance of documentation and also elements of white dominant culture, like a prioritization of the written word. How have you navigated the tensions? So that is getting clear and specific and how values were operationalized without overly relying on one way of knowing.
Yes, you first start by identifying white dominant culture practices, right? And talking about it openly so that everybody is like there's a level setting. So this was very interesting because different teams did it different ways. You know, you have some teams like, let's say, and this is not true, but I can just imagine, you know, the documentation has to look a particular way with the finance department than it does over in another department, right? And so it was really like talking about white dominant culture, helping folks identify, you know, white dominant practices, talking about alternative practices and saying, like, let's look at what that would mean to implement those alternative practices. And again, you have to have space for experimentation. And so if we have, you know, if we're identifying the way that we set up our data reporting or any of these are indicative of white dominant culture, then let's try out a new approach. And that's what I mean by getting that feedback from partners. So one of my favorite things that they tried out was, you know, really thinking about art and stories, right? And allowing folks to really tell the story about the work that they were doing in a verbal storytelling way, like on a tour, in a written story, or in submitting like a portfolio of art or photos that really spoke to what they were learning from the work that they were doing. So those are some examples.
Thank you. Okay, you have mentioned building evaluation capacity within the foundations, but what about the nonprofits? They usually don't have the capacity to do evaluation. So how are we building the capacity of nonprofits to track and tell stories in a way that works for them? Should TBP include capacity building for the nonprofits?
Absolutely. That's the support beyond the check. So when I transitioned out of the community foundation that I was at, my role moved more into this very thing because there was an understanding that the capacity of the organizations may not have been there. We are working from a one-sided implementation approach where we're like, yeah, we're going to change everything, but then the capacity is not there for the nonprofit organizations to respond to even that change. Again, more ways to build distrust. And so the ideas that I had that I never got to implement because I transitioned out, but I do know it was not just me. It was a lot of conversations with a lot of people who were really excited. So I don't know what's happened since. But the first thing that we needed to do, and I was given permission to do, is to start looking at how we host sessions to bring our community partners in to write a theory of change and create a theory of change, right? And so, and then trusting the experts, bringing people in if that was needed, and trusting them to really kind of walk all of our grantee partners through that process. even doing that in some non-traditional ways. So that's the like what we do beyond the check. And so then also, I was in conversations with some evaluators across the community around for organizations who needed a little bit more support. How could we contract with them to provide that support for them? So you are absolutely correct, building that capacity before or during, because I still think of it as like shared learning. And so what we would like to be doing with you all, because that can also be oppressive and imposing if we're like, you have to go to this session in order for us to do this. So it was really starting the conversation. I was able to assess for some of our partners interests and if they actually believed they needed that or if it felt like something that we were imposing on them. And the beautiful thing is I didn't come in and, just say, this is what we're doing. What would it look like to help you better understand the work that you're doing? Not tell us the work that you're doing. What do you want to know about your work? And you start from that perspective so that they are able to learn first and foremost for themselves. And then we get that learning after that process is there for them.
Okay, thank you. And we did have somebody ask if you and Andrea were comfortable with sharing your LinkedIn profiles, if you could maybe pop them into the chat. People would like to connect with you. We've also had quite a few compliments, so thank you.
Thank you.
And we do have one last question in the chat. Can you give examples of how you create learning rhythms, structures, infrastructure within an organization?
Y'all questions are getting me excited and making me think back to I love the job, clearly. It was ideal. Yes, so this was challenging because again, my role was created to do this. And I came from academia before I came into this role. So, of course, I'm like, we're going to do training modules, we're going to do all of this stuff. We eventually got there, but I needed to build relationships, build trust. And then we started talking about accountability. So it was really, really important for us to talk about the responsibility that we all hold within our organization for making sure that we're engaged in reflection and learning, and hold ourselves accountable for that. And to think about that, like in a grantee, grantor, philanthropy relationships, we had power. And so we were power, and power can choose not to learn and grow and really understand the impact that they're having in community. So for us, it was equity learning and culture was then empowered to implement a learn and grow plan across the organization, and everyone had to have a learn and grow plan. This was supported by, I was on the leadership team. This was supported by the others on the leadership team. And it was daunting, but we got there. And everyone in the organization had a learn and grow plan that was operationalizing the core values of the organization, meeting them where they were. They could identify all of their own goals, but they had to be connected to really learning to operationalize or to within their particular roles, how they would implement anti-racism and what transformative relationships meant. So they were given resources to do that. And then there was some accountability measures put into place, including tied to their bonuses. So a lot of that happened as a new way of holding ourselves accountable for the learning that had to take place. By the end of it, it was a beautiful thing, but you can imagine putting in requirements was really hard and challenging, but most people by the end of it were really on board, and we left choice integrated into how they chose to grow and learn, but it had to be collective and towards our shared goal.
I'd just like to add that Kenlana has done a beautiful job of transitioning some of these learnings that she got from the foundation experience into her work in collective impact, because there are a lot of similarities. And I have appreciated that with our collaboration in that respect.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We do have another question in the chat. Andrea, did you have more slides to do, or is this?
It's not necessary. I did have a couple more, and then our email addresses at the end.
Okay.
One important piece of information I wanted to share was that trust-based philanthropy has technically been around since 2014. There were a collection of foundations that rallied around the Whitman Foundation's creation of this strategy based on their grantee feedback. But it wasn't, I don't believe it was until about 2020 when the trust-based philanthropy project was formed with some of the movement from these foundations to, kind of formalize this approach. And that was in 2020, not long after George Floyd's murder. And so what we had was, and the other major event in 2020, as we know, was the pandemic. And so I said to Kenlana, I think there were a whole lot of white people sitting around thinking about how they're going to address this equity issue, how they're going to, increase trust and do things differently in the context of the pandemic and this new awareness. And yet they hadn't really completely thought it out. And until the trust-based philanthropy project had really come into its own, there really wasn't any emphasis on evaluation and learning. So some foundations took off without that learning in place and not the structural shifts. So there's a lot of potential. We, as evaluators, have so many really deep participatory social justice approaches that have deepened our response, especially in recent years. But the fundamental structure of philanthropy needs to be addressed in the process. And that's fine. I'm done with my part. So
Okay, thank you. Then, yeah, I think if we could have your email addresses up here. We had a lot of great questions today, and I know there's still a couple more in the chat. So I think we probably have time to do one more. Do you have any resources on collective impact?
Oh, yes. Yes.
Okay.
Andrea's smiling because I'm like, that's my jam too. I get excited to talk about these things. Yes, if you email me, I am happy to share.
Okay,
Mhm.
perfect. So we have
also, if you Google Collective Impact Forum, that's a place that has a ton of
Yes.
information.
Yes.
And you can focus on evaluation there or many other subtopics within.
And if you are here in Kalamazoo, Collective Impact is happening and it's alive through the Kalamazoo Blueprint for Peace. So if you follow that model, that work that's happening in community, you're also invited to come into that space and think about your role in the collective. So follow our work because we're implementing the model here in Kalamazoo.
Okay, well, thank you both so much for your time today, and thank you everybody for joining us.
Thank
We
you.
hope we'll see you back in 2 weeks. This recording will also be available, and we'll go ahead and share that with you. But thank you so much for joining us, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.